What kind of lunatic tracks the fuel economy of a modified GTI? Welcome back and thanks for being here. My name is Scott, and I'm sure one look at that title must have had you wondering, who does that? Well, I do. I have tracked the fuel economy of all of my cars ever since my very first one. I think it might be something I picked up from my mother. I have a vague recollection maybe of her having a little notepad, and she wrote down the odometer and tracked all of her mileage. We didn't have a lot growing up, so looking back on it, she probably was tracking every penny, including fuel expenses. And I kind of took up the habit too. Not necessarily because it's going to make me spend less on fuel or drive less. I just kind of did it. If you track your fuel economy and you see something suddenly out of the ordinary, it could give you a clue of something is going wrong. Of course, today's cars monitor themselves and set that check engine light, so maybe I'm wasting my time, but it's entertainment and I will continue to do it. Back when the car was stock, I got 39.6 miles per gallon descending from the mountains of Tennessee to the coast, and that was during the car's first trip to Tail of the Dragon. Later, I developed this 200-mile road circuit where I could make consistent drives to test fuel economy at efficient highway speeds, and I did that to support an article that I wrote about how different loads affect fuel economy. I tested rooftop cargo boxes, I think maybe my basket, definitely the baby trailer and the cargo trailer, and I don't know if I did the hitch mounted basket or not, but I did these to test the difference between it all. If you're into that kind of stuff, check it out. I'll put a link in the video description below. I did all of that testing before I was shooting video, so I don't have anything to share here about that. Unfortunately, I did not test the fuel economy after upgrading to Bond Performance's cat back exhaust, and I wish that I had. I had planned to test fuel economy after the Bond upgrade, but I had visited him in July and wanted to do my testing in October. I prefer to do my fuel economy testing in the spring and fall when I can drive comfortably without the air conditioner. And sure, that boosts my fuel economy numbers, but it also enables me to achieve consistent results. October came and I was ready to test, but then I had to make a pair of road trips to California. Before I knew it, I had jumped into an IS38 upgrade without testing the Bond exhaust. But I don't look back. Moving forward, I wanted to see if the IS38 presented a reduced exhaust restriction or if the lower turbo spool might have improved my fuel economy on a well-behaved trip. The IS38's turbine exducer opening is 3 millimeters larger than that on the IS20, and that's only 6% larger, but it's bound to yield slightly less exhaust restriction, and that's kind of evident in the additional exhaust note. Less restriction leads to better fuel economy, which is why I wanted to test the Bond exhaust setup as well, because it too has less restriction. I drove the 200-mile circuit at the posted speed limit early on a Saturday morning in May to avoid driving in traffic and running the air conditioner. I drove exactly 200 miles and filled with just 5.1 gallons, resulting in 39.2 miles per gallon. I hadn't beaten my previous record, but I was still amazed with getting 39 miles to the gallon on an IS38 GTI. However, there was a problem. It's not hard to argue that even a small deviation during the fill-up could have resulted in a change. After all, 5.1 gallons isn't much. Squeezing in another tenth of a gallon would knock off almost a full mile per gallon. Could I have squeezed in another half gallon? I don't know. I needed a longer route to narrow down my margin of error. It's difficult to leave my area without being forced onto the interstate. I refuse to hypermile, which often requires driving below the speed limit, especially on an interstate highway. Instead, I drove my same test route but continued farther west along the rural Highway 58 to Danville, Virginia. That more than doubled the distance of my test. Check out this photo of my new route. Traffic was light during my morning drive, but Highway 58 west of Emporia has more rolling hills, and I was fairly certain that the hills would have a negative impact on my overall fuel economy. I also encountered a slowdown at the local tunnel on 664. What if I told you that the speed limit inside the tunnel is the same as outside the tunnel? As I got closer to home, I realized that I could stretch the drive and make it my longest single tank of fuel. I continued along Interstate 64 past my exit to see if I could get 500 miles out of a single 13-gallon tank. My extended route took me to 502 miles. I still had some room to drive farther, but I decided against taking the risk. I refueled with just 11.9 gallons, resulting in 42.2 miles per gallon. I couldn't believe it. Of course, driving the speed limit on a 55 to 60 mile per hour road is boring. Plus, it's not realistic in most areas. I decided to take the car on another trip to Emporia. This time I went the long way around on the interstate and I ran the air conditioner. I drove between 70 and 80 miles per hour, but mostly I was doing about 75. The drive was 242 miles, and when I came back, I needed just 6.6 gallons. That tank, even with mild speeding and air conditioning, still returned 36.7 miles per gallon. But what about with a trailer? I had just finished a 7,600 mile trip with my cargo trailer, and with that, my worst tanks were in the 19 to 20 mile per gallon range due to driving high speeds. Trailers don't do well at high speeds, and when I say high speeds, I'm referring to, say, 70 to 75 miles per hour. And my best tanks were at the lower speed limits in California, right around 55 miles per gallon, and at that speed I was getting 24 to 26 miles per gallon. So how could I do on my 55 to 60 mile per hour circuit with the same trailer after an IS38 upgrade? Well, with the trailer in tow, I use 7.8 gallons for the 214 mile drive. That's 27.4 miles per gallon. Some GTI owners don't get that well with just the car alone, so I don't know what to tell you. At this point, I'm sure plenty of you are calling BS on all of my testing. And to be clear, I did not rely on the dash display for reporting my numbers. All of my calculations are by hand on a calculator, miles driven divided by gallons dispensed. I used the same fuel pump for each fill-up, and for my fueling method, I saw this on, I don't know if it was the fast lane or somewhere else. What I would do is I would run the pump until it clicked off, and then I would wait 30 seconds for any foam in the tank to settle. Then I would pump slowly until it clicked again. After that, I would squeeze it up to the next tenth of a gallon. That just makes for easier math. And that's not as perfect of a fill-up as when I could fill all the way to the brim on my TDIs, but it's about as consistent as I can get without damaging my evaporation canister. Sure, there's still some room for error, but I cut that error in half on my 500-mile tank. Now, I think it's worth noting that these were not freak tanks. If you look at the data for all of May, you can see that I had a pretty good month, mostly because I wasn't driving aggressively. I got the IS38 upgrade at the end of April, and I did some aggressive driving in April to test out the IS38 and get my initial impressions of it. And then I started my fuel economy testing in May. And so in May, I drove very efficiently or somewhat normally, no hot dog, and maybe just a little bit of thrust, maybe. I mean, I wasn't a total angel about it, but I still was pretty efficient. And then, of course, you can look at June. In June, I'm still doing pretty well, too. Maybe a little less because now I'm not focusing on efficiency, but I am just driving more efficiently. Even before my IS38 upgrade, I was regularly asked, how do you get such great fuel economy? After all, even I'm a skeptic when I see someone posting a high fuel economy number, especially if it's accompanied by a photo of the instrument cluster readout. Well, other than having a turbo that doesn't pull the car into action below 3,000 RPM, here are 6 of my most effective tips. Number 1, stop speeding. Yes, I know that's a tough one, but speed is the #1 killer of fuel economy. Higher speeds lead to greater wind resistance, which requires more engine power and fuel to move the car. Number 2, maximize the use of your top gear. If that's a GTI, that's 6th gear on a manual. On a Golf, it's 5th on a manual. And if you're driving a DSG or another automatic, then stay out of sport mode so that the transmission will get into the top gear sooner. On the manual transmissions, there's a little shift indicator on the instrument cluster. I used to ignore that all the time because I like driving around 2,000 to 2,500 RPM so that the engine was a little more responsive when I wanted it. If I wanted to make a quick thrust or a quick pass or something, I like to already be there. I'm kind of a lazy driver. I don't always downshift when I should. But now that I'm driving a less responsive turbo, I've been content to just drive in 6th gear anytime I'm driving faster than 45 miles per hour. Sure, it's a dull way to drive, but it's efficient. Check out this video by Engineering Explained if you want more details about how lower engine speeds lead to better fuel economy. Number 3, take highway routes. This may not work if you're a city driver, but the engine will run far more efficiently if you can get on the highway and drive at steady speeds. The longer you drive at a steady, economical speed, the more your fuel economy will climb, to a point. In some cases, taking a longer highway route may be more efficient than driving a shorter stop-and-go route. Number 4, avoid drive-through windows, and that's a big one for me. I spend less time in drive-through lines now that I no longer have a daily commute. Idling your car in drive-through lines wastes a lot of fuel. And the same can be said of traffic lights, so run those lights when you can. I'm just kidding, but think about the math. When you sit and idle the car, you're getting 0 miles per gallon. And anytime you average 0 with any other number, the average of the higher number will fall. The more zeros you add or the longer you idle, the lower your average will be. And so that's why the auto start sequence has been added to just about every car now. So it's shutting off the engine at stoplights, at traffic lights, to save fuel. And sure, right then and there, it doesn't make that big of a difference, but over the course of an entire tank, it will add up. Along the same line, don't warm up your car. That wastes fuel as well. Start your car and then idle it while you fasten your seatbelt, plug in your smartphone and choose your music, and then drive gently until the oil temperature reaches 180 degrees. I think if, at least on the GTI anyway, probably on all Volkswagens, I can't speak for other cars, but when you start the car, it'll idle at a slightly higher idle, say 1,000 RPM before dropping down, and that drop down usually takes about 30 seconds. Once it gets to that point, there's no reason to sit and warm up the car. I mean, I suppose if you're trying to clear ice off the car or something, but again, still, you are wasting fuel when you do that. Scrape off the car before you start it, then get in, start it, 30 seconds later, drive away. Number 5, accelerate gently. Brisk acceleration requires more fuel. And I have to admit, if I had a DSG instead of a manual, I probably would accelerate more briskly because I just wouldn't feel quite as restrained. And the car would, of course, eagerly just go. But if you're not in a rush, accelerate with, say, half throttle or less and shift at 2,500 RPM for good fuel savings. Engineering Explained has a video about that too. I'll link that right up here. And then number 6, minimize your braking. Some people put their car in neutral and then coast to a stop using their brakes to stop the car. Instead, downshift and let the engine slow the car. And I'm not saying you have to be aggressive about it, say throwing it in the 2nd gear from 40 miles an hour or something, just a gentle downshift, just as long as the engine is being turned by the wheels instead of fuel. Because when you're coasting with the car in gear, the wheels are turning the engine. If you have the car out of gear, then the car has to use fuel to keep the engine turning. But if you're rolling with the car in gear, then the rotation of the wheels will keep the engine turning, and then your injectors are practically shut off. And if you don't believe me, watch on the cluster. You've got an average fuel economy, which is what a lot of people watch, but then there's that instantaneous economy readout on your instrument cluster. Watch that. slowing down with the car in neutral and using the brakes versus slowing down with the car in gear, I guarantee you, you'll see a difference. But Scott, my car is made for fun. This is boring. And yes, I agree with all of that. The thing I like about my GTI is that it's a great compromise between power and efficiency. Sure, it can't get the fuel economy of a Prius, but a Prius can't surprise anyone with brisk acceleration. On the other hand, my GTI can't outrun a Corvette, but a Corvette can't touch the GTI's fuel economy or its utility. Plus, it's a whole lot more expensive. So where do you draw your line? Have I given you anything to think about with regards to fuel economy or economical driving habits? I see some people posting in discussion forums that how do you do it? And it's not just me. I'm not the only one that's getting 35 or 40 miles to the gallon. Other GTI owners are doing it as well. And it's kind of, I don't know if it's disappointment on their end, jealousy, or skepticism, but there are those out there who drive their GTIs and just can't do any better than 23 to 25 miles per gallon. And so they see fuel efficiency as something that's impossible. I look at it and I think it's got to be their driving habits or where they're driving, how fast they're driving, just something. So think about what I've shared with you today. Will you change your driving habits even for just a month to see if your fuel economy improves? Comment below if you give it a shot and see some results. As always, I appreciate you being here, and I will see you next time. Take care.